Hi, this is Dan Larison from the American Conservative. I'm senior editor there, and I'm talking with Zack Beauchamp. Do I have your name right, Zack?
Yeah, that's right. You pronounced it right in the way that most people don't.
Well, I was alerted to that uh, earlier on, so I'm glad I got it right. Okay.
It's a pretty common problem.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a world correspondent at Vox.com.
And so we're talking today about several things, starting with Hillary Clinton's Atlantic interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, which has been the talk of the last several days. It was released over the weekend and has generated a lot of commentary on all sides, mostly to the effect that the former Secretary of State has tried to distance herself, or has seemed to try to distance herself from the administration's policies, and is doing so by emphasizing her long-standing hawkish views on foreign policy, which are not a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to her career, but which seems to have come as a bit of a shock to many people. And maybe we could talk first about why it is so many people are surprised that she's taking the line that she is, when we know this is the line she took when she was in the administration.
Yeah, I think it's because Clinton now is perceived less by sort of her Syria policy and her foreign policy views in general, despite having been Secretary of State, and more has a sheen of essentially anointed Democratic candidate slash all-around competent, well-respected person. That is to say, most people didn't pay a lot of close attention to the internal debates inside the Obama administration the way that, say, you and I did, because we write about foreign policy professionally. But they saw that Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, she generally, seemingly on all the major public issues, did fine. It seems like her most public moments were, generally either well done or otherwise well received by the American public. And as a consequence, she has an astronomically high approval rating. Liberal Democrats even see her as a standard bearer, despite her association with her husband's sort of moderate administration and her own relatively, or at least perceived as, moderate stance relative to Obama. And so she ends up being just seen as the anointed Democratic candidate rather than someone who disagreed with the administration internally about its foreign policy positions. Do you think that's right?
I think that may be part of why there's been probably more of a backlash than I guess I expected there to be, because there is a lot of protesting about her seeming lack of loyalty to Obama. Right, that she was given this position in his administration, and this seems to be a poor way to repay him now that he's coming under a lot of fire from outside actors, from other people in Washington, for her to sort of pile on and join in the chorus saying that he's gotten important decisions wrong. I'm not sure that I'm not surprised by that aspect of it, because ultimately she's going to do what's best for her future career, and I think she has always wanted to distinguish herself on foreign policy by taking somewhat more hardline positions than her party would normally prefer. Most people in her party would normally prefer. But I think I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Look, I think she also genuinely believes this, right? As she advocated for arming the Syrian rebels, which is what she criticized Obama for not doing in the interview. Inside the administration, she developed a plan for it with David Petraeus. They put it together. They tried to sell the administration on it, and Obama vetoed it because he didn't think it would work.
Right.
I think correctly, by the way, that he vetoed it by not thinking that it would work.
Right.
But the point is that this isn't just Hillary Clinton politically positioning herself for the general election or for a certain class of donors who are interested in a more hawkish American foreign policy, or for elite foreign policy audiences. This, I think, is actually what she thinks.
Right,
a major policy issue.
I think that's right, and you can see that through the consistency with which she's taken these positions over almost the last 20 years. I'm not sure in the first term of her husband's administration, maybe she wasn't quite as much in favor of these sorts of aggressive measures. But I think certainly by the time that the U.S. gets involved in Bosnia, she was, as I understand it, she was someone in favor of doing that, and that really propelled her in that direction to adopt more consistently hawkish views from then on, and I think that's right.
Yeah, what was really interesting about that interview, though the Syria issue is the one that people are focusing on because it was the most direct criticism of the president. But I thought that her lines on Israel and Iraq in particular, or not Iraq, sorry, Iran, were interesting. She didn't talk that much about Iraq. Her Iran speech in particular, because she took a very sort of strong stance about the amount of a nuclear program, to simplify things greatly, that Iran should be able to preserve under the course of any agreement. And on Israel, she sounded extremely hawkish.
Yes, absolutely. She was essentially entirely in favor of the Gaza operation and was even defending Netanyahu on his remarks about wanting to retain control over security in the West Bank after any negotiated settlement, which I think most people paying attention to this question recognized as his statement that he was no longer seriously considering a two-state solution as people had previously understood that to mean. And so she was essentially giving everything Netanyahu had done in the last several weeks her total support, and that does come across as quite striking and as a much more forceful rebuke, I think, of administration policy than what she said about Syria. Because on Syria, she was qualifying things in the full interview. She was qualifying things and hedging her statements quite a lot, saying, well, we can't know for sure what would have worked. Whereas on Israel and also on Iran diplomacy, she was coming out and more or less saying the position that the administration has taken on both of these things is the wrong one to take, and it's the one I wouldn't take. That's how I read it. And those were very direct and pointed blasts against, not only Obama, but against Kerry as well.
Yeah, it was, again, comparatively, I mean, in as much as any of this is subtle, understated, but the message was quite clear, especially on the Gaza offensive, where the administration had been, over the course of the war, increasingly critical of the Israeli position. But, the political side, like setting aside the substance of this, of, whether or not Clinton's right in this dispute, I imagine we would both have opinions on that. But this seems like a really bad idea politically in terms of where it would position herself inside the Democratic Party. I don't think she's going to have, she's in a very good position both in the general and in the primary, but I don't see why it makes sense to read this as her trying to help herself. If anything, this can only get her into trouble.
Yes, and I think we've seen already how it's starting to get her into trouble and how it's signaling to a lot of people within her party that her political instincts are either out of practice or aren't very good to start with. Because she's essentially poking a large part of the Democratic coalition in the eye with all of these statements, in some ways more blatantly than others, and she seems to be repeating, as far as people in the Democratic Party are concerned, the same mistake that she had made ahead of her 2008 campaign, which is to essentially take the liberal hawkish line on just about everything, so that the differences between her and the eventual Republican nominee are, while they may exist, are not nearly as great as people in the party would like. And so she's setting herself up for attacks on that where she doesn't really have to. And as you say, because she is well positioned for the general election, assuming that she does in fact run, which we're all assuming, she doesn't really need to tack to the center on foreign policy as much as she feels she seems to want to do. And so she's also not taking into account the attitudes of the general public outside of the Democratic Party, which are much more risk-averse and averse to military conflict than they were even 5 years ago. So I think she's badly misreading the landscape in her party, and she's misreading the landscape in the country at large.
Yeah, part of the problem is that, I don't know about problem, but part of the explanation maybe, is that no one really votes on foreign policy unless there's a major war ongoing that's involving U.S. battle debts.
Sure.
There would have to be, unless there's, like something on the equivalent scale of World War II, but sort of fear-mongering aside, we're not anywhere near anything like that. And so in that world, largely, it's in the general, people are free to do what they want. It's the primary, I think, where these things matter more because the money is much tighter. People who have ideological views that might align with your party and will vote and donate for whoever the eventual winner are still trying to figure out how to sort out their allegiances. And foreign policy, I think, can matter a great deal there more. Now, I don't have any real quantitative research. I don't know of that, though I'd love to see it, showing whether or not foreign policy matters more in primary elections. But my guess is it does, which is sort of underscores, I guess, two things. First, both of our agreement that this is politically unwise, and two, the agreement that this is just her representing what she actually thinks.
And I think the reason why it would probably be more important in the primary is that you have, at that point, you have activists that are willing to challenge all of the primary candidates on these issues and not willing necessarily to just roll over and accept whatever their eventual nominee wants to do. Whereas in the general election, there would be much more of an incentive for partisans to tolerate disagreements on those sorts of things. Whereas in a primary, they have an incentive to throw a fit and to try to raise obstacles in the way. And there seems to be at least a little bit of that going on in the initial reactions to Clinton's remarks, which I actually found to be a little bit more of a resistance or more of an opposition to what she had said than I thought would happen. Everyone keeps saying that the anti-war left has largely vanished under Obama, and to a large extent I think that's true. But you did start to see a few stirrings of some of these activist groups trying to seize on Clinton's remarks and to put up warnings along the way to say that they aren't going to tolerate too much hawkishness. They might put up with a bit of it, but they're not going to accept Clinton going all the way in the way that she wants to go.
Yeah, I think that this demise of the anti-war left thing is understated in part because it treats the Iraq War, the level of opposition to the Iraq War, especially in the political left, as the standard. That in Vietnam as what sort of the normal baseline is, when in reality, right, Vietnam and Iraq are huge aberrations in American history, right? We usually, as a country, do a whole lot of low-level military operations, more like Kosovo, more like Libya, more like Haiti, more like Gulf War I is even comparatively large, right? And this low-level stuff very rarely engenders massive public opposition. It's just not, right. It doesn't happen very much. And Obama hasn't done any of that, right? On civil liberties, I think there's more of a case that the civil liberties left is quieting down under Obama in a way that they probably shouldn't be. But I think that the narrative about the anti-war left in general is a little bit overstated. We'll see, if, let's say hypothetical President Hillary Clinton wants to start a war with Iran, maybe that's a separate level or category of activism that might be generated. But I think that general theory misses the role and the way that war changes American public opinion. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And another counterpoint to what I said would be that obviously the reaction against the proposed strikes against Syria last year was extremely strong on left and right for various reasons, but there was a very strong popular reaction against that idea. And that in itself was, as you note, fairly unprecedented because considering how small the operation was supposed to be, it shouldn't have generated that kind of resistance, but it did. And I'm not sure why that is. Do you have any thoughts on why there was so much resistance over Syria, whereas, for example, on Libya, the public basically shrugged about it?
I think that, it's hard to say. All we have is theories. My best one is that Syria seemed like a situation in which the United States was going to do something pointless or it was going to do something that would involve a massive extended deployment. Right. Libya was comparatively small, which is not to say it's not significant. It was dramatically important for Libyans, and it mattered for American foreign policy in the region, and it mattered in humanitarian terms, I think, greatly. But it was not at the scale of the Syrian civil war, which is, I believe, currently, in terms of monthly amounts of violence, the most dangerous and deadly conflict in the world. And the proposed airstrikes wouldn't have done anything about that. They would have
And they weren't intended to
sent
do
some
anything
kind
about that, in fact.
Yeah,
That was
right.
the point, yeah.
And the worry was about mission creep, I think, for most people. It was of
Sure.
these strikes are pointless, and if you get involved in Syria, what is that going to mean? It's going to mean that you own the Syrian conflict now, and you have to escalate. Now, I don't think that logic is always true, but I think given how scary the prospect of U.S. involvement in Syria was, especially given that chemical weapons, like that was the limited objective he was talking about. Securing Syrian chemical weapons is a massive military operation. To do it right, it would have involved, according to the Pentagon estimate, something like 70,000 troops.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
strikes weren't going to do that. So there was a huge risk of escalation in Syria that wasn't, I think, true in the same way in Libya.
Right. And that brings us to the current operation in Iraq,
Right.
Which we were going to get to, which began just last week. Actually, it was announced just last week. And there isn't as much mission creep potential there as there was in Syria. But there's my concern is that there certainly is plenty, and there is already some of that beginning to happen with the announcement that you have small numbers of special forces being landed in and around the Sinjar Mountains to facilitate relief efforts. And so my concern about that is that it will eventually increase to a point where it becomes a major commitment that pulls the U.S. in for a protracted engagement that wasn't envisioned originally and isn't desirable for us. You take a different point on that.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. And I think that it's not true because of the nature of the military operation. The Obama administration has defined the objectives in like almost surprisingly narrow terms, right? Usually it's something open-ended, like deal with Gaddafi or the situation in Libya, or until Al-Qaeda no longer poses a threat to the United States. Whereas here, the objectives are very, very limited. It's one, get the Yazidis on the mountain off and prevent serious harm, essentially genocide for the Yazidi people going on there, right, by virtue of the large concentration of the population on the mountain, one. And two, to limit ISIS incursions into Kurdistan generally and support Kurdish operations in pushing them out. And there have only been something like 15 or 20 strikes, somewhere in that ballpark, to date in support of the Kurdish operations. And that's deliberately limited because the amount of U.S. air power necessary to deal with ISIS, and on that one front, ISIS is fighting on an innumerable number of fronts. It's almost hard to keep track of all of them. And so repelling them from one position with U.S. air power, not trying to solve the ISIS crisis, is an achievable objective. And it's one that can be done with a limited amount of military force and doesn't seem to pose a huge risk of escalation unless the mission itself expands. But that's a separate problem. That's not this operation causing it. That's the Obama administration making a decision that they need to help the Iraqi central government take out ISIS. It's just a separate operation.
It will technically be a separate operation, but it will come about because the original commitment was made in this one. And you're already starting to hear people talk about how we now must destroy ISIS. Michael O'Hanlon had an article in Foreign Affairs this week making an argument for a larger number of ground forces in order to drive back ISIS and eventually take over or take back the territory that they have taken over. And that's the sort of escalation that I'm worried that this will end up leading to, because there seems to always be political pressure that inexorably leads towards this kind of greater involvement. So that even when an administration goes in with every intention of having a limited intervention, that intervention will then give rise to another one or a much larger version of itself down the road. Just looking at the way that Libya evolved, Libya was originally justified as essentially a defensive or protective measure that then grew into a full-scale war for regime change. And even if you think that that was worth doing, That wasn't what was advertised at the beginning, and the war did turn into something more than what was originally being presented to the public.
Well, the thing about Libya is I don't think it was I don't think it was not a deliberate escalation. Let me put it that way. I think that the administration knew that achieving the original goal of civilian protection, which was like the immediate goal, was stop them from advancing into Benghazi, the Libyan forces, to stop a massacre in Benghazi. The broader justification for that was that there needed to be a serious effort for civilian protection from Gaddafi by a U.S.-led international force. That was the underlying principle behind it. Whereas here, the administration is a very, very clear limiting principle about what it doesn't want to do or how it doesn't want to escalate, which is it doesn't want to do anything without serious political reform inside Iraq. Now, good luck on that happening. That would actually be great if there was real political reform inside Iraq. I'm not even sure that would trigger a broader U.S. military action. And more broadly, I think the mechanism isn't just that the intervention happens and then there's some kind of sort of vague political pressure that causes them to escalate. I think that when mission creep does happen, it's because administrations see that the objective that they've set either can't be accomplished at all or would require some larger amount of force in order to accomplish. Now, they're frequently wrong about that, whatever. But in this case, the objective that's set is limited. It would involve having to shift the objective for the Obama administration to say, okay, we think that military force can destroy ISIS, or we think that broader military force can effectively deal with the ISIS problem. And so far, I mean, they've been very, very clear that they think that the second thing isn't true, and that's been true since June. And U.S. escalation has somewhat ramped up since then. A few deployments of observers who were very clearly designed to gather intelligence, to enable limited amounts of airstrikes if the U.S. government said they were necessary. But its underlying political analysis of the situation hasn't changed, which I think is a pretty strong limiting principle as compared to other sorts of interventions.
Well, I certainly hope that's right. My concern is that the pattern has usually been to find new or additional reasons to keep a mission going, or to add things on to an existing mission. And I suppose my concern is I don't have a lot of confidence that if there are demands for that coming from Congress, which I assume there will be, I don't have a lot of confidence that the White House will turn them down over the long run. They may turn them down initially, but they seem to get pulled in the direction of those that are agitating for greater U.S. involvement, even if it takes them a while to get there.
Well, what's the objective or the mechanism by which mechanism is more accurate, that they could use to pressure Obama into doing this, right? Is it just the sheer fact that Congress people are calling Obama and telling him that he needs to escalate, and so he'll just do it because they tell him to or because they're asking him to? I'm trying to trace exactly how this is supposed to happen.
What I have in mind is that there's constant public agitation for a certain course of action, and that then starts being echoed in the media as we've seen agitation for intervention in this case has been echoed. And that's going to then lead or create a situation where the president feels as if he's being essentially hectored into taking some sort of action, if only to get these people to shut up. It seems to me that has happened to some extent in Syria, which is why we're going through the motions of providing any assistance to the opposition in Syria, where even people in the administration don't think it's of any use.
Yeah, I think that what's happening there, in Syria anyway, is that they felt some kind of belated need for their own internal reasons to say, like, we should do these limited arms provisions, maybe it will help the Syrian rebels. One argument that I've heard made on behalf of people who think this idea works is that it's a way to gather intelligence about the rebel groups themselves. That is to say, providing the arms itself is a mechanism by which you learn about the rebel groups, and if they're not too large, then you figure out which ones are worth supporting, who's aligned with ISIS, who's permeable, etc. And, you hear these arguments repetitively. I think it's fairly clear to everybody that the amount of arms that the U.S. is providing right now aren't going to alter the balance of forces
Sure.
Or the war in Syria meaningfully. I think that if the administration really thought that there were huge risks to it, independent of anything else, I don't think they would use it as a throw a bone to Congress type thing, though I'm sure that does happen in certain circumstances. Whereas escalating in Iraq is a different order of magnitude. Right, this is a president who ran on getting and extricating the United States out of Iraq and never going back into that kind of quagmire. And he says this every time that he speaks about Iraq. And, there are dozens of examples of American military interventions not escalating. For instance, we're still on and off conducting drone campaigns in a variety of different places. And, this is not a defense of drone campaigns. It's just that those are limited exercises of military force that are designed to accomplish the goal of, damaging terrorist organizations. Now, they do this by killing people, lots of innocent people. This, again, is not intended as, a normative comment on the drone campaign, so much as a point that they've managed to stay limited because of what their objectives are. We don't see calls to occupy Somalia. And I think that this is a similar case. It's even a similar type of objective, right? The objective being limit the gains made by a sort of extremist group, an Islamist extremist group. And in fact, it's more limited than the drone campaigns because they're supposed to destroy or decapitate al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda affiliates in different countries, whereas here the goal is just to repel ISIS advances on a specific battlefield, not to decapitate ISIS, kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, to demolish the organization's foundations. It's in many ways more limited than what we regularly do and what we've all gotten used to as a sort of permanent form of warfare that no one talks about.
Well, I suppose, yes, it's true that right now it is still much more low level, and I hope that it stays that way, and that it doesn't lead to any of the things that I'm talking about. I would be very pleased if that was the case. What puzzles me, I guess, about this current intervention is that there were calls to do something very similar to this a few months ago, and essentially the argument then was we needed to do this to shore up Maliki's government, the Iraqi central government, but because Maliki was such an undesirable figure, such an unlikable figure, because of his sectarianism and his abuses, that couldn't really be sold. But now that we're doing it on behalf of the Kurds, that can be portrayed in a better way. But in the end, we're still functioning as the police for Iraq's civil war, which is presumably going to be an ongoing role for, as Obama has already acknowledged, at least months, and probably longer than that. And so I suppose I do worry about it becoming another one of these ongoing open-ended commitments that we need to begin in the business of getting out of rather than finding new ones to add on.
So, I don't know. I guess I think more contextually about these things. Rather, I don't think a short-term military intervention is necessarily a good or a bad thing, or necessarily, going to escalate. I think the question is whether or not, on the merits of this particular situation and its similarities to other ones in the past, is it likely to escalate, and are the benefits worth the risk? And in this case, I think the benefits are worth the risk. There's a discrete and serious harm being done to large numbers of people, the people trapped on Sinjar Mountains. And it's awful. We can go into detail about what the situation is, but it's tens of thousands of people trapped on a mountain without access to food or water. In the meantime, the Kurds, another seriously oppressed minority in Iraq and really around the region, are losing not major amounts of territory yet, but significant amounts of territory, doing serious harm to prospects for stable economy over the course of the long term, to people's livelihoods, and limiting ISIS involvement in that territory is a good, and it's also good in frankly American national security terms, because then you have a reasonably stable, secure, clearly understood by ISIS to be a no-go area without risking real airstrikes that they don't want to deal with. And that allows for a certain amount of stability in the regions, and from some American point of views, right? Like, frankly, narrow oil interests. Flowing oil out of Iraq is probably good. It's not that that's the only justification. I imagine it can't not be part of the thinking here. All those things put together, and it suggests to me that, based on what we know right now, the way that the objectives are defined right now, they're worth the risk. That said, no one's a crystal ball. Escalation is unpredictable, and these things are difficult to do, but it seems like, based on the details of the situation, there are some really concrete benefits to getting involved in a very, very narrow way.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly, so maybe we could move on to the new article that you wrote this week, just today, in which you talk about a lot of these issues at greater length, and in particular your discussion of what you call solutionism versus managerialism in terms of how the U.S. should approach these problems. And so maybe you'd like to first summarize what you mean by those terms and how you think that relates to the U.S. role in the region.
Sure. Yeah, the basic thrust of this article, it's called How America Lost the Middle East, not to imply ownership to begin with, but rather that the United States had a great deal of influence during the Cold War in the 90s that disappeared starting around the end of the Clinton administration and the second Bush administration. And there are lots of different reasons why that's true, but I think that to get to the point that you just mentioned, Dan, solutionism is, the way that I define it in the piece, an idea that the United States can solve big, overarching problems in the region. In the past, it negotiated some really important agreements to put a tamper on the Arab-Israeli conflict, so it sort of orchestrated a regional realignment in favor of a pro-stability, more pro-American bloc with some dictatorships in Israel. And these led to major changes inside the region that in certain ways made it more amenable to American interests, and also solved some serious humanitarian problems, or some of them, not all of them. This is debatable. Solutionism, anyway, is the idea that we can still do that now, that the United States has so much influence left that it can transform the Middle East, the very politics of it, the fabric of the region as a political unit. And my claim in the piece is it can't anymore for a variety of reasons, and instead we need to start thinking in more managerial terms, which means there are certain problems, the Syrian civil war, the Iraq civil war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the United States is incapable of solving at present by virtue of the way those conflicts operate and their own internal logics. Instead, we have to do things that can make the situation more manageable, better for both people on the ground and from an American point of view, in as much as we can, and do it in a very limited, precise, useful way without trying to take on too many risks that for problems that we can't solve anyway. And basically, that's what managerialism is.
Right.
So that's
that the U.S. should be trying to mitigate or minimize the damage coming out of specific episodes or specific incidents, but not trying to have some sort of grand unifying approach to the entire region that will somehow eliminate these problems entirely. Would you say that's...
Yeah, that's right. It's the idea that big solutions are possible right now just is wrong. Now, that might not be true in 10 years, but it's definitely the case right now.
Well, and something I picked up from what you were saying in that article is that it's not just a question of having limited power and limited influence, but there's also a question of whether we actually know how to remedy these problems. And given our experience over the last decade or so, coming to the conclusion that on some of these things we really don't know how to do it, and don't have the means to do it, and we're finally, or we should be able to recognize that by now, and we would get ourselves into a great deal of trouble if we fail to recognize that.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it. I hadn't thought in those terms, but by saying that we don't know how to do things, like take, for instance, the total chaos in Libya that's going on right now, the lack of government authority. It's not just that the U.S. doesn't have enough resources to pump into the problem. It's that, to flesh out your theoretical point a little bit more, it's that we don't know what to do. We don't know how you build a state under those circumstances. What are the right things that you do? Who do you support? Who are you friends with? Where do you put money into first? What kind of legal rights can you protect first, and how do those lead to the foundations of a stable society? Essentially, what it's asking us to do is to understand in fast motion how to build and construct an entire stable society, which is a thing that, I mean, development economists barely even understand, if they understand at all, how that happens naturally, let alone how to make it happen using military force or resources or sort of economic resources or whatever. So talking about it in knowledge terms is actually kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, well, even if you could identify how to do that in one place, if you had, suppose you had enough specific area knowledge and enough people who were really well integrated into the country in question, that expertise wouldn't apply necessarily anywhere else, and it wouldn't travel very well. And so it's, even if you could figure it out in one place, you're not going to be able to rely on that as a regular way of remedying these problems. And I remember back during the early stage of the Iraq War debate, lots of people were saying, well, we know how to do these things in a post-war environment because we did them in Germany and Japan, aside from the fact that they vastly exaggerated how much we actually did. There was also the matter that what may have worked in those very unique post-World War II situations aren't going to translate into other countries in entirely different eras.
Right. Yeah. One of the interesting things that I found in the piece is that there's a political scientist at GW, his name's Alex Downs, and he, with a co-author, looked at 70 different cases of the sorts that you're describing, and found that the U.S. actually tried a lot right around Woodrow Wilson's presidency, this kind of nation building in the Caribbean. And it failed disastrously, as it did in most of the other cases that he looked at, the 70 at the data set and a few others in an expanded data set and a response that he had with another political scientist. And in countries where there wasn't already the foundations for a stable democracy, either a long history and tradition and normative belief in democracy, or lots of money that could allow you to get along very well in modern economies, then yeah, it's really, really hard to build new countries. It's not easy, especially in democracies.
Right. And so that ties into your point that you're making towards the end of your article, that the U.S. should recognize that it's not, I think you put it as, in the driver's seat in this region, and I think that lesson would apply very well to other parts of the world as well, that the ambitions that some people have for what the U.S. should be trying to do and what the U.S. can actually realistically accomplish are very far apart. And so I think what we can agree on is that those ambitions need to be scaled back to something that's much more readily obtainable without these grand multi-decade schemes that people will sometimes throw out as the solution to our region's problems.
Yeah, I think that the U.S. generally, this is sort of as a rule of thumb, does a better job when it's trying to protect organic developments, or otherwise when it's outside of its own borders, than when it's trying to impose new orders. So I think East Asia is a very interesting parallel with the Middle East in this regard. I think the U.S. has a huge role to play, maybe a larger one in East Asia, because the sources of tension there are state-to-state conflict over territory and resources, which is the thing that conventional military deterrence, U.S. alliances with mutual defense pacts with Japan, deployments in South Korea, or the kinds of tools that we know from lots of different experiences are fairly effective at dealing and sort of deterring escalation. Whereas, in the Middle East, what are you going to do to tell ISIS not to start attacking a town in Lebanon? How on earth could anything available to the United States meaningfully prevent that from happening?
Right.
The answer is it couldn't, or prevent the root causes of that happening again in the future. It couldn't, right? It depends on the internal logics of different places, and in maybe IR theoretical terms, it's regional subsystems, right? You have an East Asian subsystem, you have a South Asian subsystem, different European subsystems, and each of them don't operate according to one global system. They all have different discrete local logics. I think the Middle East has its own, and even different parts of the Middle East do. And so it's one that's uniquely, in some respects, hostile to any attempts to manage it by external powers. Not just the United States. Russia couldn't do any more than we could.
Right. Well, no, and probably less, given
Yeah.
their current alignment with the two governments in the region that the vast majority of people in that region absolutely hate.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so there, I mean, it would apply to all outside actors, not just to us. I agree with that. Maybe circling back around to the Clinton interview, as we were possibly bringing this to a close here in the next little while. What I found striking about the Clinton interview, as much as anything that she said about policy, is the fact that the only issues that she was asked about, and the only ones she talked about, as far as I can recall, were all focused on Middle Eastern issues. And I think that it does reflect the extent to which our foreign policy debate very often seems to get reduced to talking about maybe 3 or 4 of those issues to the exclusion of almost everything else, or at least it eats up most of the bandwidth. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and why you think it is that we are still so preoccupied with that one region to the detriment of paying attention to everywhere else.
I mean, I think it's at least to me fairly clear that it's a result of the past decade and a half of American involvement in the region. It's one. I mean, even before that, there's a lot of stuff that fairly clearly affected the United States. Or the U.S. was deeply involved in and decided to get itself involved in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War. But after 9/11, there's this cliche: after 9/11, everything changed. Well, that's probably not true in broad systemic terms. It is true, I think, in the way that the American public paid attention to foreign policy. The Middle East didn't just become a problem there, it became perceived as a problem for Americans, a place whose development, even though Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan, right, this became about the Middle East and Al-Qaeda originating from there and radical Islam and so on. And the perception became that we need to be involved in the Middle East because otherwise there will be serious risks to American interests and American livelihood and so on and so forth. And interest in the region spiked dramatically. Again, this is a thing that data could resolve. I'm sure that's true. But that means that to this day, there's still a great deal more concern with the Middle East than, say, a hypothetical threat from China. I mean, right now, China isn't threatening anybody in the United States. It's not even close to threatening anyone in the United States. It's even debatable if it's thinking about aggressive, like really, really aggressive military measures against anyone in its neighborhood. Russia, also too, aside from nuclear deterrence, which no one thinks is a serious risk right now, Russia isn't threatening to invade the United States or even an American ally, a NATO ally. It's involved in Ukraine. And these are things that people do care a lot about, judging by, what gets a lot of news attention and what you hear people talking about when I talk to sort of policymakers and so on. But the Middle East is dominant because it is perceived as being, probably wrongly, the region that's most relevant to U.S. interests. That's at least my guess. What do you think?
Well, I imagine that's why it gets the most attention. I also imagine that it may get the most attention because these are perhaps the most. I think that maybe the conflicts in that part of the world are easier to dramatize or over-dramatize, depending on how you look at it, because I think because they do feed into this perception of being a conflict that not only the U.S. has to fight because it's perceived as being somehow a necessary or essential conflict to be fighting, but that it's also one that the U.S. can in some way prevail in through its superior power. Whereas my guess is there's less interest in saber rattling against countries that would actually be extremely expensive and dangerous to fight wars against. That's just a guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I suspect that people are not very interested in risking nuclear war over Ukraine, or
Right.
even in East Asia with China. I think that nuclear deterrence is a thing that people don't talk about very much anymore, but still operates and is super scary because nuclear weapons are super scary. That's the
Right.
point. That's why it works. I do think that matters. Yeah.
Sure. And all right. Well, then I think we can wrap up then. So I want to thank Zach for a great conversation, and thanks to all of you for watching, and hope to do it again. Thanks, Zach.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye.